In the musical of Les Miserables, the two characters Valjean and Javert play a continual game of cat and mouse. Valjean is a criminal. He's been convicted of his crimes. He's been punished for his crimes. And yet, at some point in his life, he experiences a single act of grace by a kind human that changes his perspective on everything. And he becomes a paragon of kindness to those in need for the rest of his life. He completely pivots, changes, and he serves others for the rest of his life. Javert, on the other hand, is a man whose record is squeaky clean and who sees the entire concept of law and order as a very rigid system, an absolute system of punishment for wrongdoing with no potential for redemption or forgiveness. He says at one point in the script, "I am the law, and the law is not mocked." It's his very rigid perspective, his obsession with a tit-for-tat kind of justice that drives him to pursue Valjean as a fugitive for decades on end. But he's never able to capture him and make him pay for his crimes as he believes that the man should have to. But after years of this going on, in an ironic turn of fate, it's actually Javert who ends up being captured and put in the custody of Valjean. And he looks at the whole situation and he says, "Well, I know after all these years of pursuing you, now that you have my life in your hands, I'm doomed. There's no other way this could go. The calculations all come out to you killing me." And Valjean saves his life. He lets him go free, demonstrating that people can change and that mercy triumphs over judgment. Now that's a really wonderful moment, but here's what I want you to think about today. Javert's thoughts of justice are so rigid that even in that moment where his life has been spared, he sees a merciful man before him and he cries out in despair, "The law is inside out and the world is upside down." And he hates it and he can't stand the idea that something that he believed for so long and so rigidly is wrong, and he can't stand to live in this world anymore. Because he cries out in despair that the law is inside out and the world is upside down. I think the author of that story meant for that to be instructional for all humanity. Because, brothers and sisters, praise God, that is exactly what forgiveness does. It turns the law's exacting requirements inside out, and as the enemies of Christianity said in the first century, it turns the world upside down. That is exactly what forgiveness does as God gives it to us. And so God spoke through one of his apostles and said, "You were dead in your trespasses and sins and the uncircumcision of your flesh, and yet God has made you alive together with him, having forgiven your trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us because of the legal demands of law. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross." Forgiveness turns the law inside out and the world upside down. And there is no better place to see that than at Jesus' cross. The plan of God to save mankind from sin is beautifully subversive. Now, in case those words don't register, let me explain them just a little bit here. When we say something is subversive, what we mean is that it's ironic in a way that no one participating realizes the irony. Okay, that's what we're talking about there. And why I say that about the cross is because it is in the cross that the world looked at a man who appeared to be stricken by God, forgotten by God. And they didn't realize that that man was carrying all of the love of God in that one moment. It is a beautifully subversive thing that God takes mankind's evil and flips it into his greatest good. The law is inside out and the world has been turned upside down by the grace of God. I got to thinking about all of this because of the 23rd Psalm, if you can believe it. The 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. Even if I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil because he is with me." His rod and staff comfort me. He prepares a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. All those kind of thoughts in that psalm that are so familiar to us. You know what I started wondering about that? How did it end up right next to Psalm 22? 22 is the one that says, God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? But 23 says, Thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. 22 says, I am poured out like water. My heart is melting like wax within my breast. And 23 says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. 22 says, I am a worm and not a man. I am scorned by mankind and despised by the people. And 23 says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. How did those two end up right next to each other? And really more than that, I started thinking, because 22 is quoted from the cross, does 23 still fit the cross? And the answer is yes. I think that even though Jesus only quotes from one of those two psalms, both of them have a perspective that makes sense there at the cross. Because in the cross, the world is turned upside down and the law is turned inside out when a righteous Son of God dies in the place of all of us sinners. In the cross, God allowed the most extreme ugliness and hatefulness of mankind to give way to the beauty of his love. Yes, we might have watched the events of the cross and thought we were seeing a beaten man, forsaken by his God, and afflicted for no purpose whatsoever. It might have looked to our eyes like all of hell had broken loose and evil had won the day. But the resurrection on Sunday morning tells us what was really happening 3 days ago on Friday, when God was subverting all the workings of evil so that their actions will bring about the greatest good that has ever been accomplished. In Les Miserables, Javert's thoughts of justice are so hardened that he looks at the merciful man in front of him and he cries out in despair over what has happened. But when we stand at the cross, we are very much like him in some ways and very much unlike him in another. Because we look at the merciful man hanging on the cross before us, and rather than cry out in despair, we cry out in victory. The law is inside out. The world is upside down. The requirements and the legal demands of the law have been nailed to that cross. And we have forgiveness from Jesus. And so as you think about the cross today, try to think of it through these words. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.